I stumbled upon something. I was putting a lesson together, and if you're on the internet at all, there's lots of fodder for material. And so I saw this old post of a video with John Piper and Kevin DeYoung, which are mainline, evangelical guys. And it's something I had posted years ago, actually, and which DeYoung pretty much says in his conversation with Piper that assurance of salvation is vested in the authority of the church, and your assurance comes from hearing the elders tell you that you're saved. Because by golly,
they would know.
This is the Reformed, I'm not going to say Calvin's doctrine, the power of the keys. The power of the keys doctrine goes way back with the church fathers. All right, so lest it be pinned on Calvin, and with statement following that that's not us, that's Reformed, I will hesitate from making it a Calvinistic doctrine. So anyway, I posted that and made some comments on it, and got some feedback from some people who were just utterly shocked that Christians believed that. Not our church. So I'm like, well, I thought it would make an interesting discussion, so I started digging, but found something, because what I'm doing is I'm latching on to different aspects of how the gospel is presented in the church. All right. So I stumbled upon this other article I had written, and it boils down to this. According to the Protestant false gospel of justification by faith, salvation is like cheating at school. Okay? So where did I get that? Well, we'll soon find out. It was from a video interview from John Piper. Okay? So here I say in the post, years ago I criticized a pastor to a Christian friend. She misunderstood my criticism as an endorsement and said the following: right, because we are not saved by works. We're not saved by works. The idea I criticized concerned the pastor's assertion that sanctification is a Sabbath rest. So I was criticizing for that. So her response was, oh, well, of course sanctification, or the Christian life, is a rest. We're not saved by works. All right? So here was a lady who I considered a pretty knowledgeable church-going Christian, and her view of sanctification of the Christian life is that you can't do works in the Christian life. That's works salvation. So you see how a whole bunch of professing Christians see the Christian life as a salvation process. All right? Actually, what Protestant Orthodoxy refers to progressive sanctification is really misleading and disingenuous. What they believe it is progressive justification. So you've got beginning of justification, progressive justification, and final justification. And that's pretty much the way it's stated in Protestant Orthodoxy as well. Okay? Can a true born-again Christian be guilty of works salvation and sanctification? We would say no, but most professing Christians would answer yes to that question.
But the very statement itself, listen, you're talking about in sanctification, work salvation. Those are two separate things.
Yeah, but true.
Sanctification and salvation are not the same.
True. And 20 years ago, every Protestant, and when I say Protestant, I mean Methodist, I mean all kinds of Baptists, everybody, okay, that falls under the realm of Protestantism. I've been in a lot of different denominations. I've taught at a lot of different churches, different denominations. I've gone to Methodist churches. I've gone to every kind of Baptist church. And, it's all relatively the same functionality concerning what they believe about justification. 20 years ago, the vast majority of church-going Protestants and professing Christians believed and functioned like sanctification and salvation were two totally different things and just totally separate, right? Okay? Justification and salvation were the same thing, and salvation was a once and for all time finished work by God, once saved, always saved, blah, 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 right? Okay? Now, what the vast majority of Christians in America didn't know 20 years ago, as Protestants, that's not Protestantism. That's not Protestantism. Okay? John Calvin and Martin Luther deemed that view as a false gospel and said so. All right? So once again, and I'm glad I wrote the book, The Truth About New Calvinism, it's the only book out there that definitively, accurately describes the contemporary history of how the Protestant church found its way back to true Protestantism. Okay? Even the Calvinist of the Protestant church 20 years ago didn't even know what Calvin believed about the gospel, and for that matter, didn't even know what Martin Luther really believed about the gospel. Okay? So you can also so where did the new Calvinist movement that has brought us back to true Protestantism, where did that movement start? In the hallowed halls of Westminster Seminary in Pennsylvania. Okay? All of the, you name all of the big names in Reformed theology. Hello, they didn't even know what Protestantism was. It took a Seventh-day Adventist by the name of Robert Brinsmead, who was invited there to discuss with, the brain trust of Westminster Seminary, what he was going around teaching in conferences that was really turning the evangelical world upside down. Okay? And they were like, oh my goodness. Okay? Oh my goodness. He's right. Okay? So, I mean, you hear Christians talk about historical precedent. Don't give me historical precedent. As late as 1970, I think they invited Brinsmead and some of his colleagues to Westminster Seminary, 1976. Jay Adams was a professor there and raised the roof. How dare you invite a Seventh-day Adventist to Westminster Seminary? Okay? You know, why don't you feed them pork, see how that goes over? And Jay Adams was not happy. Okay? But what happened was, because of controversies in the Adventist movement, and particularly the Awakening movement that happened in the 60s amongst the Adventists, okay, Brinsmead decided once and for all, and by the way, he's still alive. He's now a professing atheist, but he's still alive, living in Australia, owns a fruit farm over there. I almost, back in the day when I was researching for that book, I almost went over there and visited him. Okay? But him and I did email back and forth quite a bit. So he actually sat down and read all of the Reformed writings front to cover, and published a publication called Present Truth that was actually sort of a modern day Calvin Institutes of the Christian Religion. Okay? It was a contemporary rendering that really enabled me to understand Calvin's Institutes. It's really well written and easy to understand. Okay? So, that's how we came back. Now, more people who go to church kind of get it. Alright? They kind of get it, much more so than in the old days. Okay? But one of the big challenges of the new Calvinist movement and how it has effectively taken over the evangelical church and brought it back to its true Protestant roots, okay? One of the biggest challenges was to get churchgoers away from this whole idea that sanctification and justification are two different things. Okay? Now, they use doublespeak because they'll start out by saying justification and sanctification are never apart. They're never apart. And this is actually a statement by John MacArthur Jr., by the way, word for word quote. They are never apart, but they are distinct. Or the way he puts it, they're distinct but never separate. Okay? Then he goes on to say, the fact that they're distinct refutes progressive justification. He denies that it's progressive justification, but it obviously is. But listen to this statement. Justification and sanctification are never separate, justification and sanctification are distinct, but never separate. See, it's just doublespeak. Right? It's doublespeak. Okay? It's like saying, this is exactly like it's saying. Okay? A cat who walks across the street is never separate from his catness because they're distinct. Well, what's the distinction? It's the cat sitting on the side of the road and the cat walking. Right? But that's never the same thing. You see how silly it is? Really, And of course, pastors and parishioners alike with degrees and all kinds of things sit out in his congregation like bobbleheads and go, yep, amen, brother. It's disgusting, right? At least it is to me. So, now, here's another thing, okay? So this whole argument about the separation or sanctification and justification being two separate things, okay? So most professing Christians, if not all of them, believe that it goes without saying that Christians sin. Well, this is kind of big. This is very telling. First, they really don't understand in biblical context the word in biblical context, and I think this would be a good place to start our study. That is by explaining the word sin. Explaining what the word sin means in biblical context. However, in all cases, the biblical word sinner denotes someone who is under the condemnation of the law. Okay? In the Bible, a sinner, the biblical definition of a sinner is someone who is under the condemnation of the law. Okay? That's the biblical definition of that word. But yet, one of the most well-known truisms among professing Christians is what? We are all just sinners saved by grace. What's that statement saying? That Christians are still under the condemnation of the law. That's what it's saying. And in effect, yet unregenerate. That's what that's saying. Oh, I'm not saying that. I don't believe that. You just said it. Okay? But, in fact, what I just said, Christians are still unregenerate, under the condemnation of the law, and still need salvation. That is, in fact, Protestant orthodoxy. That's right out of Luther's writings. That's right out of Calvin's writings. Okay? This is, in fact, the calling card for American Christianity's false gospel. By calling themselves sinners, they are confessing they are yet unregenerate and under the condemnation of the law. There are only two kinds of people in the world, under law and under grace, lost or saved, right? And yes, technically, the American Protestant false gospel is like going to salvation school. This is where we're getting into our And maybe you will pass and maybe you won't, and if you do, it's because you let Jesus do your homework and he also took your test for you. Okay? So that's what it's like. I'm not kidding you, right here. Sanctification is school. Justification is your admission into the school. And you graduate with a degree in final justification if you let Jesus do your homework and take your tests for you. In an interview where John Piper was discussing Doug Wilson, he stated exactly this example. Okay? You think it's just my little simple? So here's the interview. A little introduction, he said, to Doug Wilson and why I'm eager for him to be a part of this conference with an antidote. I was listening to a sermon of his the other day. He's preaching his way through Romans as I'm making this video, and he gave an illusion of the difference, or illustration rather, of the difference between good advice and good news. And he said good advice is a teacher saying to her class, you study hard, memorize your paradigms, do your homework, and get it in every night, and you'll do fine on the final exam. And of course, all that's really good advice. And then the exam comes, and the teacher's walking down the aisle, and she sees the young fella sitting over a blank piece of paper, not able to write anything on the final exam, and she stops and says, more good advice. Just try to remember everything you've studied and give yourself attention here and just relax. That's all very good advice. And then he said, that is Doug Wilson, but if she says, scoot over and I'll take the test for you, now that's good news. Now, when I heard that, I thought, okay, there are three things about that characterize Doug Wilson. Number one, it's true. And Doug gets the gospel right. Especially substitutionary atonement and justification by faith alone. Okay? So basically what they're saying here is sanctification is substitutionary atonement. Okay? The Christian life is substitutionary atonement. Let me reword that a little bit more. The Christian life is a substitutionary covering. All right? So again, our sins aren't ended. They're only covered. And even the covering's a substitution. Okay? And speaking of the last days, and he, that is Christ, is going to take our place, and his righteousness is going to count for me at the last day, and that will be my solid ground. Okay? So, note that his righteousness doesn't count for us now. It'll count for us in the last day. If we do Jesus right in our Christian life. This is overt work salvation. Just in your face work salvation. Okay? In your face justification by works of the law. Okay? Number two, he says to Doug Wilson, it's risky to give illustrations like that because you might have somebody say, well, if God's going to take the test for me, then I can just fool around all semester long. That's antinomianism. And my response is, if you don't preach in such a way that somebody responds like Romans 6:1, that is, let us sin that grace may abound, you're probably not preaching the gospel. Now what we'll look at next week is these yo-yos don't even know what the biblical definition of antinomianism is. Okay? Antinomianism really has little to do with this whole idea of forget the law, no law. Okay? But we'll talk about that next week. Suffice to say for now, they don't even know what antinomian is, as far as a biblical definition. He says, we've got to preach good news, not good advice, is the ground of our salvation. All right? So basically, sanctification is this minefield, right? Where if you don't do anything just right in a way that allows Jesus to do your homework for you and take the test for you, you mess up your salvation. Because it's a what? Righteousness of your own, right? Okay. So that's our message of salvation, he says. So it's risky, and Doug Wilson is a risk taker. We all know that. Okay? So, we of the called out assembly of Christ, saved by the new birth, not works of the law, like the justification by faith, false gospel, would say that being enrolled in school guarantees our salvation. We belong to the family of God, and He sends us to a boarding school called discipleship, right? We're learners of the Word. We learn Christ, okay? That guarantees our salvation. And the learning process is done by us, the help of the Spirit notwithstanding, and our graduation is a reward, not salvation. See, that's the big difference here. We go to school for a reward, they're going to school for salvation. Okay? So I like the example that John Piper gave me here. I'll use it. We do our own homework and take the test ourselves, resulting in Christ saying, "Well done, faithful servant." Right? Salvation is not a works program that earns salvation by letting Christ do everything for us. I used to like to say, if you remember, we did this podcast series where at the beginning of it, I would play Bachman Turner Overdrive song, Taking Care of Business. Because in the song, it's got this lyric that says, we're working hard at doing nothing every day. So in this salvation construct, you're working really hard at doing nothing so that Jesus is standing in your place and not you on the final day. Okay? Salvation is not a works program that earns salvation by letting Christ do everything for us. Alright? Now, many of the Protestant stripe will say, John Piper doesn't speak for us. Well, actually he does. Alright? John Piper is endorsed by every well-known evangelical leader in the country. Period. Okay? Period. He's endorsed by John MacArthur Jr., name one. They all endorse him. Okay? We have cited him extensively regarding his statements that Christians still need to be saved through obedience to church authority. He said it. In his Romans series, and as far back as 1994, he said that we're not talking about how believers were saved. I'm paraphrasing. In this Roman series, we're not talking about how Christians were saved by believing the gospel. We're talking about how the gospel presently saves us. Then he goes on to say, Christians need to be saved. That's what he said. This is as far back as 1993, 1994. All right, you want to know something? That's Protestantism. Okay. Now, granted, a couple, 2,000 or 3,000 people sat out in his congregation and actually listened to that and probably bobbed their heads and said, "Amen, brother." That's really, really scary. Okay, that's really, really scary. All right. Now.
So often that congregations listen to who is speaking,
Mm-hmm.
but not what they're saying.
That's totally true. Oh. Well, John Piper, if he's saying it, it must be true. Boy, howdy, who knew? You know, I still need to be saved. Which means, if you still need to be saved, it obviously means you're still under the law, right? I mean, if I still need to be saved, obviously, if you understand anything about the Bible, I'm still under the condemnation of the law. You know? So, yeah, we're Christians, but we're not under grace, we're under law. To be fair, what Protestantism teaches, unsaved people are only under the law. But if you're saved, you're under both. Okay? You're still under law and the condemnation of the law, but you're being sanctified with grace. So you're both. Romans 6:14. For sin shall not be your master because you are not under law but under grace. For sin will no longer be a master over you, since you are under law. And that's one that's yeah. So Romans 6:14 is what I was thinking of. Okay. It's one or the other. You're either under law or under grace, and if you're under grace, sin no longer has dominion over you. Okay?